Hey everyone, and welcome back to Western Flavors. Before we get into our new episode, let's recap the thrilling and mysterious events from our last story. We followed a disguised Thai on his secret investigation into Nathan Price. His surveillance led him to a clandestine meeting in Calgary between Nathan and a group of sinister oil executives. Hiding in a maintenance closet, Ty overheard the entire horrifying truth. His disappearance was part of a 4-year-long conspiracy, and Nathan's plan is to marry Amy to gain control of Heartland and its valuable resources. The story ended with a changed and enraged Ty, his mission no longer about finding his own past, but about protecting his family's future. If you missed that incredible, jaw-dropping story, the full playlist is linked for you in the description below. If you're enjoying this new season, please take a second to hit that like button and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a chapter. Now today, the hunter becomes the hunted, as Ty's discovery leads to a desperate fight for survival. Ty's memory returns. Heartland Season 19 Fanfiction Episode 15. The cold, triumphant laughter from the private lounge was a muffled sound on the other side of the wall, but for Ty, it was a deafening roar. He stood in the suffocating darkness of the maintenance closet, his body rigid, his hands clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists. The truth, in all its dark, sinister, and unbelievable detail, had crashed down upon him, and the wreckage of his own understanding was a chaotic, burning heap in his soul. He was not a victim of a tragic, random accident. He was the target of a meticulous, 4-year-long conspiracy. Nathan Price was not a kind, well-meaning rival. He was a predator, a wolf in sheep's clothing, who had been patiently, systematically, and ruthlessly circling his family, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And his family, his beautiful, innocent, and completely unaware family, was in the gravest danger of their lives. A wave of pure, white-hot, and completely incandescent rage washed over him, a feeling so powerful it almost made him black out. The urge to smash his way through the wall, to burst into that room and wrap his hands around Nathan Price's throat, was a primal, almost irresistible force. He wanted to see the look on their faces, the shock, the terror, as the ghost they had created came back from the dead to exact his revenge. But another, colder and more rational part of his mind, the part that had been honed by 2 years of survival in the wilderness of his own non-existence, held him back. He was one man. An anonymous, undocumented man with no resources and no allies. They were powerful, wealthy, and protected by a wall of money and influence. To confront them now in their own territory would be suicide. It would be a foolish, emotional, and ultimately futile act of self-destruction. He would be silenced for good this time, and his family, his Amy, would be left completely alone, completely unprotected, and at the mercy of the monster who was pretending to be her savior. He had to get out. He had to get back to the woods, back to the safety of his hidden refuge, to think, to plan. He waited, his breathing shallow, his entire being a single, focused point of listening. He heard the scrape of their expensive chairs on the floor, the murmur of their final, self-congratulatory words. He heard them walk out of the lounge, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor of the hotel lobby. He waited until the last of their voices had faded, until the only sound was the frantic, panicked pounding of his own heart. He slowly, carefully opened the closet door and slipped out into the empty, silent corridor. He made his way back through the labyrinthine service corridors of the hotel, his movements a practiced, ghostly dance. He was almost at the service exit, almost at the freedom of the back alley when he heard it. A sharp, commanding voice echoed from the other end of the hallway. Man's voice. "Hey, you, stop right there." Ty's blood ran cold. He glanced over his shoulder. It was one of the men in the black suits, one of Nathan's lackeys, and he was not alone. The other one was at the far end of the corridor, blocking the other exit. He was trapped. They hadn't just been having a meeting, they had been running security, and he had been so focused on what was happening inside the room that he had been completely blind to what was happening outside of it. He didn't think, he just ran. He burst through the nearest door, which led not to the outside, but into the loud, chaotic, and steamy environment of the hotel's main kitchen. Chefs shouted, pans clattered, and a wave of hot, greasy air hit him in the face. For a split second, the chaos worked to his advantage. He dodged around a stack of crates, slipped on a wet patch on the floor, and scrambled back to his feet, his mind racing. The 2 men in suits entered the kitchen right behind him, their movements calm, efficient, and utterly menacing. They were not panicked. They were professionals. He saw an exit at the far end of the kitchen, a door that led out into the back alley. It was his only chance. He sprinted, his work boots sliding on the slick, tiled floor. He shoved past a surprised kitchen porter, ignoring the man's angry shout. He was almost there. He burst through the back door and into the cool evening air of the back alley, a dark, narrow canyon between the towering brick walls of the city. He ran, his lungs burning, his heart a wild, terrified drum against his ribs. He could hear the heavy, rhythmic pounding of the suit's expensive dress shoes on the pavement right behind him. The chase was a desperate, adrenaline-fueled blur. He was a man running for his life through a dark, unfamiliar urban landscape. He vaulted over a dumpster, he scrambled up a chain-link fence, the metal biting into his hands, and he dropped down into another, darker alley. He was faster, more agile, a product of a life of hard, physical labor. But they were relentless. He finally found a moment of refuge, hiding in the deep shadows behind a large, overflowing garbage bin. He crouched, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps, and listened. A voice echoed from down the alley. "He went this way. You take the north end. I'll take the south." He can't have gotten far. Ty knew he had only a few seconds. He looked around, his eyes scanning the darkness for an escape. He saw it. A rusted, old fire escape leading up the side of a tall brick warehouse. It was his only way out. He waited until the footsteps of the nearest suit had faded, and then he bolted. He scrambled up the fire escape, the old metal groaning in protest under his weight. He reached the roof, a flat, gravel-covered expanse, and ran, leaping from the edge of his building to the roof of the next, a desperate, high-stakes game of urban parkour. He ran for what felt like an eternity, a lone, desperate figure against the glittering, indifferent backdrop of the Calgary skyline. He finally found another fire escape and scrambled down, landing in a different, quiet, and blessedly empty alley. He had done it. He had escaped, for now. He leaned against a cold, brick wall, his body trembling, his lungs on fire, a profound, terrifying understanding dawning in his mind. He was not just a man with a dangerous secret. He was a man who was being actively and professionally hunted. Ty spent the rest of the night huddled in the cavernous, echoing space of an abandoned warehouse on the industrial edge of the city, his body trembling with the last violent vestiges of adrenaline. He was a cornered animal, his mind a chaotic whirl of his new, terrible knowledge and the very real, very immediate threat of the men who were hunting him. He was no longer just a ghost with a forgotten past. He was a witness, he was a liability, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that they would not stop looking for him until he was silenced for good. He waited until the first, pale, gray light of dawn began to seep through the grimy, broken windows of the warehouse before he dared to move. He knew he couldn't stay in the city. It was a trap, a concrete and glass labyrinth full of surveillance cameras and unseen eyes. His only hope, his only chance of survival, was to get back to the one place where he had the advantage, the wilderness. He had to get back to the woods, back to the familiar, concealing darkness of the Alberta foothills, back to his hidden hut by the river. The journey out of the city was a tense, paranoid ordeal. He moved through the back alleys and the forgotten industrial corridors of the city, a ghost in a landscape of rusting metal and crumbling brick. Every passing car, every distant siren, sent a fresh jolt of fear through him. He felt like a man with a target on his back, a feeling he was beginning to remember with a terrifying cellular-level familiarity. It took him the entire day, moving on foot, keeping to the shadows, to finally reach the outskirts of the city. As the sun began to set, he finally left the last of the sprawling, oppressive suburbs behind and stepped into the vast, open, and welcoming expanse of the prairie. He was still a long, long way from his refuge, but for the first time since the chase had begun, he felt like he could finally truly breathe. He walked all night, a solitary, determined figure under a vast, star-dusted sky. He was fueled by a potent cocktail of fear, rage, and a desperate, all-consuming need to get back to the one place that felt like home, the one place where he could plan, where he could think, where he could figure out how to protect the family that didn't even know he was alive. He was deep in the foothills now, the familiar, pine-scented air a welcome comfort. It was the early hours of the morning, that strange, liminal time just before the dawn, when the world is at its darkest and its quietest. He was exhausted, his body a single, screaming ache, his mind a numb, empty blank from a lack of sleep. He was following the sound of a familiar creek, its gentle, gurgling music the only sound in the profound silence of the woods. He was so focused on the simple, mechanical act of putting one foot in front of the other that he didn't notice the ground in front of him give way. The creek bank, softened by a recent rain, crumbled beneath his boot. He cried out, a single, sharp sound of surprise, as he tumbled down a short, steep, and rocky embankment. His head connected with a large, smooth, and unforgiving river stone with a sickening, final thud. And then, the world dissolved into a profound and absolute blackness. He lay there, his body half in, half out of the shallow, icy water of the creek, completely unconscious. And it was here, in this place of profound physical trauma, that his mind, which had been so brutally and artificially silenced, finally, violently broke free. He was inundated with a chaotic, overwhelming flood of returning memories. They were not the gentle, fragmented flashes from before. They were full, vivid, and powerful scenes crashing over him in a relentless, non-linear torrent. He saw her, Amy, a teenager with a smudge of dirt on her cheek, her eyes blazing with a fierce, defiant pride in the dim, dusty light of the Heartland barn. It was the first time he had ever seen her. He saw her again, a few years older, standing in a field of wildflowers, a brilliant, beautiful smile on her face, as he got down on one knee and asked her to be his wife. He saw her on their wedding day, a vision in a simple, elegant white dress, her eyes shining with a love so pure, so absolute, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He saw her in a stark, white hospital room, her face a mask of beautiful, exhausted triumph as she held their newborn daughter in her arms. He saw the baby, Lindy, her tiny, perfect face, and he felt a wave of paternal love so powerful it was a physical, crushing weight in his chest. These were the happiest, most perfect moments of his life, a brilliant, golden river of a love that had been his entire world. But then, the river turned dark. The beautiful, sun-drenched images were violently ripped away, replaced by the cold, sterile whiteness of the room in Ontario. He saw the cold, indifferent face of the doctor. He felt the sharp, terrifying sting of a needle in his arm. He felt the profound, soul-crushing despair of his own mind being systematically, deliberately, and cruelly erased. He saw the face of his own biological father, a man he had barely known, dying in front of him. He saw the angry, contorted face of his stepfather, Wade, his voice a torrent of drunken, abusive rage. He saw the back of his mother's truck as she drove away, abandoning him, a small, terrified boy, to the mercy of the foster care system. The love, the acceptance, the cruelty, the violence, the joy, the despair, it all crashed together in his mind, a chaotic, violent, and agonizing symphony of a life that had been a constant, brutal war between a profound, beautiful light and a deep, terrifying darkness. He was trapped in the nightmare of his own past, a man drowning in the flood of his own returning soul. He was about to break, to be completely and utterly consumed by the sheer, overwhelming force of it all. But then, in the deepest, darkest part of the storm, he heard them, two voices, clear and calm and full of a love that was a lifeline.
I love you, Ty Borden.
I love you, Daddy. The words, the simple, powerful, and undeniable truth of their love, were an anchor. They were a beacon. They were the one true thing in the chaotic, swirling vortex of his mind. He clung to them, to the memory of their voices, and he began to pull himself, hand over painful hand, out of the darkness. He opened his eyes with a sharp, ragged gasp, the cold, shocking reality of the icy creek water, a brutal, welcome return to the present. He was lying on his back in the shallow water, the first pale light of dawn filtering through the high branches of the trees above him. He was shaken. He was terrified. And he was, for the first time in 4 long, agonizing years, completely and utterly whole. He knew. He pushed himself up, his body a single, screaming protest of aches and pains. He sat on the wet, stony bank of the creek, the cool morning air a sharp, clean shock to his system. And he spoke the words aloud, a quiet, profound, and deeply emotional declaration of his own resurrection.
I am not Benjamin.
He said, his voice a raw, unused thing.
I am Ty Borden.
The moment he said his own name, his eyes filled with tears. They were not just tears of joy or of sadness, they were the tears of a man who had been dead and was now impossibly alive again. He thought of his wife, he thought of his daughter. The memories were no longer a confusing, painful puzzle. They were his, and they were waiting for him. He said his own name, and the sound of it, the simple, two-syllable truth of it, was a seismic event. Ty Borden. He was Ty Borden. The memories, which had been a chaotic, violent, and overwhelming flood just moments before, now began to settle, to arrange themselves not as a random collection of disconnected fragments, but as a life. His life. He was not a ghost. He was not a blank slate. He was a man with a history, a family, a home. He was a man who was loved. The realization was a wave of pure, unadulterated joy so powerful it was a physical force. He pushed himself to his feet, his body a symphony of aches and pains, but his mind was, for the first time in 4 long years, completely and utterly clear. He was alive. He remembered. A wild, disbelieving laugh erupted from his chest, the sound a raw, triumphant bark that echoed in the quiet, pre-dawn air of the forest. He had done it. He had come back. He looked at his own hands, at the cuts and the calluses, and he saw not the hands of a stranger named Benjamin, but his own. He remembered these hands teaching his daughter how to hold a brush to groom her pony. He remembered them holding the reins of his beloved horse, Harley. He remembered them tangled in Amy's golden hair, a memory so vivid, so full of a deep, profound love, that it made his heart ache with a beautiful, terrible longing. He thought of her, Amy, his wife. The laughing girl from the clearing, the defiant teenager from the barn, the beautiful, radiant woman from his wedding day. And he thought of his daughter, Lindy, the tiny, perfect baby he had held in his arms, the little girl with his own eyes. The joy of their memory was a brilliant, burning sun in his soul, a light so powerful it banished all the shadows, all the darkness. But the darkness was still there, and as the initial euphoric rush of his own resurrection began to subside, the other memories, the dark, terrible ones, came creeping back in. The white room, the cold-faced doctor, and the man who had stood in the corner and watched, Nathan Price. The name, which had once been a symbol of a confusing, romantic rival, was now the name of his tormentor, and the pure, beautiful joy that had filled him just a moment before was instantly, completely, and utterly consumed by a new and infinitely more powerful emotion, rage. It was a cold, clean, and righteous rage, the anger of a man who has been profoundly and unjustly wronged. This was not a simple, tragic accident. His life, his family, his very identity had not been lost. They had been stolen. They had been deliberately, methodically, and cruelly ripped away from him by the man who was, at this very moment, living in the heart of his home, a wolf in sheep's clothing, a monster pretending to be a friend. He thought of Amy, of her kind, trusting heart. He thought of how Nathan had likely manipulated her, had used her grief, her loneliness to worm his way into her life, into her bed. He thought of his daughter, of the easy, affectionate way she had run to the man who had orchestrated her father's destruction. The thought of Nathan's hands on his wife, on his daughter, was a surge of a possessive, primal fury so intense it was a physical sickness in his gut. The new, terrible, and all-consuming question was no longer, "Who am I?" It was why. Why had Nathan done this? What was the purpose of this elaborate, cruel, and 4-year-long conspiracy? Was it just about Amy? Or was it something more? Was it about the ranch? He remembered the conversation he had overheard, the talk of oil and gas, of a hostile takeover. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a dark, sinister, and unbelievable picture. He was no longer just a man on a journey to find his past. He was a man who had just been drafted into a war for his home, for his family, and for his own life. The boy he had once been, the angry, troubled kid from juvie, the one who knew how to fight, who knew how to survive, who knew how to be a predator when he had to be, was not dead. He was just sleeping, and he was beginning to wake up. He stood in the cold, shallow water of the creek, the first light of the morning painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gray. He was a man at a crossroads. He could go back to the ranch right now. He could storm into the house, a wild, resurrected ghost, and confront them all. He could expose Nathan for the monster he was. The thought was a powerful, seductive one. But he knew, with a new, cold clarity, that it would be a mistake. He was still a man with no proof. A man with a story so unbelievable that he would be dismissed as a madman. He would be playing directly into Nathan's hands. He had to be smarter than that. He had to be more patient. He had to be more cunning. He had to get back to his refuge. He had to get back to the fishing hut. He had to think. He had to plan. He had to become the ghost that Nathan had tried to make him, a silent, watchful, and avenging spirit. He had to gather his strength, his evidence, his resolve. And then, when the time was right, he would come out of the shadows, and he would take back everything that had been stolen from him. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, its warm, cheerful light a stark, almost mocking contrast to the cold, hard rage that had settled in Ty's soul. He stood in the shallow, icy water of the creek, his body a single, coiled spring of a new and terrible purpose. The man he had been just an hour ago, the lost, confused, and gentle soul known as Benjamin was gone, washed away by the violent, clarifying flood of his own returning memories. He was Ty Borden again, and Ty Borden was at war. He pulled his battered, soaked body from the creek, his movements now driven by a powerful, almost inhuman surge of adrenaline. The cuts and bruises from his fall were distant, insignificant details. The profound, bone-deep exhaustion that had been his constant companion for days had vanished, burned away by the clean, white-hot fire of his newfound resolve. He had a mission. He had to get back to the fishing hut. He had to get back to his sanctuary. He had to plan. He began the long journey back, a journey that was no longer a confused, instinctual wandering, but a focused, determined trek. He moved through the dense, beautiful wilderness of the Alberta foothills with a speed and an efficiency that would have been impossible just a day before. He was no longer a stranger in this land. He was a native, his body and mind now perfectly and terrifyingly in sync. His forgotten knowledge of this place, of its secret paths, of its rhythms, had returned with the rest of his memories. He ran. He ran with a desperate, lung-burning intensity, his boots pounding a relentless rhythm on the soft, pine-needle-strewn earth. He was running from the ghosts of his own trauma, the terrifying images of the white room and Nathan's cold, observant face, but he was also running towards something. He was running towards his family, towards Amy, towards Lindy. He was running towards the life that had been so cruelly, so systematically stolen from him. The journey was a brutal, 2-day ordeal, a testament to the incredible resilience of his own body and the sheer, unshakable power of his will. He did not stop to rest. He did not stop to eat. He drank from the cold, clear streams he crossed, his thirst a distant secondary concern. His entire being was focused on a single, powerful, and all-consuming goal, getting back. As he ran, his mind was a relentless, chaotic cinema, the newly unlocked memories of the past 4 years playing on a continuous, tormenting loop. He saw the beautiful, sun-drenched memories of his life with Amy, a life so full of a simple, profound love that the memory of it was a physical, aching pain. He saw their wedding day, the quiet, perfect moment under the trees. He saw the birth of his daughter, the overwhelming, heart-stopping miracle of her. These were the memories that fueled him, that gave him his strength. But they were now inextricably, violently, tangled with the dark, ugly memories of his captivity. He saw the cold, sterile walls of the facility in Ontario. He saw the face of the doctor, a man whose professional curiosity was a form of pure, soulless evil. And he saw Nathan, always Nathan, standing in the corner, watching, observing, a silent, willing participant in the destruction of a man's life. The two sets of memories, the light and the dark, began to merge, to collude, creating a new and terrifying narrative. He saw Nathan, his face a mask of false sympathy, comforting a grieving Amy. He saw Nathan, a picture of paternal kindness, lifting a trusting, innocent Lindy onto her pony. He saw him at their dinner table, in their house, in their life, a serpent in their garden, a predator who had been patiently, methodically, and ruthlessly grooming his family for 4 long years. The rage that had been a clean, righteous fire was now hardening into something colder, something more dangerous. It was a cold, hard, and diamond-sharp resolve. He would not just expose Nathan. He would not just reclaim his family. He would make him pay. He would make them all pay. After 48 hours of a relentless, non-stop and adrenaline-fueled journey, he finally, blessedly, stumbled out of the woods and onto a familiar, paved road. He was a wreck. His clothes were torn to shreds, his face and arms were a crisscrossing map of deep, angry scratches, and his eyes burned with a feverish, almost manic intensity. He was a wild, feral thing, a man who had been pushed to the very edge of his own humanity and had just barely managed to claw his way back. He stood on the side of the road, his chest heaving, his body finally completely and utterly spent. He was miles from his destination, miles from the quiet, safe refuge of the fishing hut. He was on the brink of collapse. He knew he could not walk another step. He raised a trembling, bloody hand, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to wave down a passing car. But the few vehicles that passed on the quiet country road just sped up, their drivers taking one look at the wild, terrifying figure on the side of the road and hitting the accelerator. He was a monster to them, a threat to be avoided. And in a way, he knew they were right. Just as he was about to give up, to sink to his knees in the dusty gravel of the shoulder, he saw it, a familiar, old, and beat-up-looking pickup truck. A cloud of dust in its wake was approaching from the distance. He had seen that truck before. He knew that truck. A flicker of a new and completely unexpected memory sparked in his exhausted mind. A memory of a kind, laughing face, of a shared beer on a tailgate, of a brotherly, backslapping hug. He stood a little straighter, a new and completely different kind of hope dawning in his heart. The truck began to slow down. It pulled over to the side of the road just a few feet in front of him. The passenger window, old and squeaky, was rolled down, and a familiar, beloved, and utterly unbelievable face looked out at him, his own eyes wide with a stunned, disbelieving shock. It was the face of the man who he knew with a certainty that was as real and as solid as the ground beneath his feet, was his best friend. He stood on the gravel shoulder of the deserted country road, his body a single, screaming protest of exhaustion and pain. He was a ghost on the edge of the world, and the world was passing him by. He had just about given up, a cold, hard despair settling in his bones when he saw it. An old, familiar, and beat-up-looking pickup truck. A cloud of dust in its wake was approaching from the distance. A flicker of a memory, a feeling of warmth, of laughter, of brotherhood sparked in his exhausted mind. He didn't know why, but he knew the truck. He stood a little straighter, a new, desperate, and completely illogical hope dawning in his heart. The truck began to slow down. It pulled over to the side of the road, just a few feet in front of him. The passenger window, old and squeaky, was rolled down, and a familiar, beloved, and utterly unbelievable face looked out at him. It was a face he had just seen in his memories, a face he knew as well as his own, even though he didn't know his own. It was Caleb Odell. Ty felt a surge of pure, overwhelming relief, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He stumbled forward, a disbelieving, tearful grin spreading across his face. He had been found. His friend was here. Caleb, for his part, saw something entirely different. He saw a man who looked like he had been through a war. A wild, untrimmed beard covered the lower half of his face, his hair was long and matted, and his clothes were torn and caked with days of dirt and grime. But there was a desperation in the man's eyes, a profound vulnerability that cut through his rough exterior. Caleb, a man who had known his own share of hard times, was not one to drive by a person in need. He leaned across the cab, his own expression one of cautious, country-bred concern.
"Whoa there, buddy! You look like you've been through the ringer. You all right? You need a lift?"
Ty was so overwhelmed with the emotion of seeing his friend that he didn't even register Caleb's lack of recognition. He just saw the kind, familiar face, and the words tumbled out of him in a raw, grateful rush.
Caleb, man, you have no idea. You have no idea how good it is to see you.
Caleb's friendly, concerned expression instantly shifted to one of confused, wary suspicion. He leaned back slightly, his hand instinctively moving closer to the gear shift.
"I'm sorry, have we met?"
The question was a bucket of ice water, snapping Ty back to the harsh reality of his own appearance. Of course, Caleb didn't recognize him. He was a ghost, a wild man who had just crawled out of the woods. He looked nothing like the man from the memories that were now flooding his own mind. He had to be smart.
No, we haven't. I'm sorry. You look like someone I used to know. A good friend.
He said, his voice a hoarse rasp.
I've been walking for a few days. I got into some trouble back in the city. I'm just trying to get to a place called Heartland. I heard there might be work there.
The name Heartland made Caleb's posture relax slightly, but his eyes were still sharp, appraising.
"Heartland? Huh. What do you know about Heartland? What do you know about Heartland?"
Not much. Just what I've heard. Show that they're good people.
Oh.
That they help horses. And people too sometimes.
Caleb was quiet for a long, considering moment. He looked at the strange, emotional man in front of him. There was something about him, something in his eyes, that felt familiar. But it was impossible. He shook his head, dismissing the strange feeling.
Yeah, they're the best people you'll ever meet.
Oh.
But it's a sad place these days. Has been for a long time.
He looked out at the distant rolling foothills, a shadow of a deep old grief passing over his own face.
A good friend of mine, he died there. 4 years ago, we spread his ashes on the ridge that overlooks the whole valley.
His name was Ty.
The words, spoken with such a simple, profound sadness, were a new and even more devastating kind of blow to Ty. He was listening to his own best friend talk about his funeral. He had no grave. He was just ashes, scattered in the wind. The sheer, terrifying, and intricate nature of the lie that had been his death was a fresh, cold wave of horror. He had to fight to keep his own expression neutral, to not give away the chaotic, violent storm that was now raging in his own soul.
So, you need a ride to Hudson?
Caleb asked, his decision made. He was still wary, but his own connection to Heartland, his own loyalty to the memory of his friend, made it impossible for him to leave this strange, lost soul on the side of the road.
Yeah, Hudson. That would be a lifesaver. Thank you.
All right, throw your bag in the back. Hop in.
Ty did as he was told, a surge of profound, complicated relief washing over him. He was safe. He was with his friend, even if his friend didn't know it. The chapter ends on a final, suspenseful note. Caleb puts the truck in gear and pulls back onto the highway, heading east, towards home. He keeps glancing over at the strange, quiet, and intensely emotional man in his passenger seat, a man who felt like a ghost, a man who knew his dead friend's name, a man who was heading to the one place on earth he shouldn't be. Caleb didn't know who this stranger was, but he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his gut that he was about to drive a whole new world of trouble right up to Heartland's front door.